Hello and welcome. One of the big challenges the Indian engineering industry faces is to take the whole argument or discussion from cost arbitrage to value engineering. How do we do that? Well, joining me to discuss that is Dr. Sumantran, Vice Chairman of Ashok Leyland from Chennai. Dr. Sumantran, thank you very much for joining us. And this is the subject that I guess is pretty close to your heart. Can you tell us, when we say moving from cost arbitrage to value engineering, what does it mean in the Indian context at this point of time?
I think it's very interesting today. I think globally, maybe coming on top of a period of, shall we say, low economic growth in the United States, recession and difficult economic conditions in Europe, the idea of a better value engineered product that for a while used to be thought to be relevant to only emerging countries and economies like India have suddenly become popular topics globally. And I think to me this is a period of great optimism, because I think in India we have we have grown up in an ecosystem that has for the longest time rewarded what I would call cost efficient engineering or innovating to a cost advantage. In fact, I think that the volume of literature today on things like Jugaad truly does, Indian engineering a bit of disservice.
Yeah.
I think there is a different concept that I would like to think of, and I would say this is mostly oriented towards innovating to a cost advantage.
Right. So can you give us an example of this? And I was actually going to, interrupt you when you talked about Jugaad, and really the whole point that this is actually creating a negative image rather than a positive image. But let me ask you for an example first.
Well, I will again start with a philosophical outlook on this.
Right.
We have learned at the altar of the Japanese for all these years concepts like lean, just in time, Kanban, Kaizen, Gemba, and all of this has come out of a Japanese obsession with actually being extremely efficient on space. Japanese plants have actually very little real estate. When you visit the average Japanese auto plant, there's very little space, very little real estate. And so they've been trained in an ecosystem that rewards efficiency of space utilization.
Right.
And that means you can't have inventory on the plant.
Right.
That means you have just in time. That means you have mixed mode of production. You don't have large batches of production. That means you have very quick die change operations. That means line side inventory has to be extremely well managed. This is what has led to Japanese perfecting this whole idea of lean in manufacturing.
Right.
Now switch over to India. In India today, our constraints are constraints on investment and constraints on affordability of the product. And so this has allowed or forced us to grow up in an ecosystem that has rewarded being frugal with either the tools that you use or being extremely efficient in the product that you generate. And so to illustrate this with a couple of examples, let's start with the tools that you use. I remember many years ago having to discuss setting up a whole crash test laboratory at Tata Motors. This is a passenger car crash test facility.
I've seen it.
Yes, and which typically is a very expensive facility. Only the big players in the world can afford it.
Right.
And I'll give you a very simple example. The light banks that illuminate the test facility alone were estimated to cost more than the allocation of budget for that whole project, just the light banks alone.
Okay.
And finally, Indian engineers innovated with a combination of lamps used in Bollywood studios. Okay. And long story short, that facility today operates with a very, very cost-effective set of light banks that provide the kind of illumination and the kind of spectrum of color output.
Yeah.
And all done at a remarkably low cost.
Right.
Now, I think this is innovating to a cost advantage, and I think similarly one could have an example made about the product itself. Of course, there are many products today that one can be proud of from India. We've had products like the Nano, the Tata Ace, now the Ashok Leyland Dost. These have all been products that have caught the eye globally, not because they were cheap or benefited from cost arbitrage.
Right.
They are cost effective because the configuration, the design, the architecture, the selection of systems and subsystems have all been around a cost advantage. And I think engineering these kinds of things has allowed India to be, perhaps I would say, start to get some credibility and reputation for also being a source of innovation.
Right. So, Dr. Sumantran, my question here is, how much of this now and in future can be more design rather than seeming accident?
Good point. I think there was, like in all practice, it starts with a few applications or a few experiments or a few adventures. And out of that, you begin to grow a number of things. You grow a core group of people who become increasingly talented in these approaches. You begin to start to document and see what worked. For example, again, I think for a company like Tata Motors, the Tata Ace was a beginning.
Right.
The experiment with the Ace allowed the company to have confidence to try the Tata Nano. And from this grew other, should we say, the confidence and the trained people capable of taking these ideas into bigger and bigger things.
Right.
We've seen that even with our own product with Ashok Leyland Dost. I've seen what was done with the Tata Ace during my time there. I've seen the evolution with Tata Nano, and I've seen the evolution now further with the Ashok Leyland Dost. And now, as a result, one of our group companies is working very closely with a Japanese OEM to completely design and develop an engine in India for global requirements. And this is a result of two things. One is people who have done this and therefore have acquired confidence to do this. The second is people who have done this and therefore have developed credibility in the eyes of outsiders to say they can do this.
Right. So, last question in some ways, how many of these products are truly world-class cutting-edge products in terms of quality, feel, design and so on? And are we even headed in that direction? And if not, what lies ahead?
In one of my lecture circuits, I have a very, very interesting slide. Whenever we talk about cutting edge and design and innovation, we talk necessarily about very complicated things.
Right.
And I have a very simple slide quoting Mr. Ingvar Kamprad, the founder and the owner of IKEA.
IKEA, yeah.
And the quote goes, I'm not quoting verbatim, but the quote goes something like, to design a table that sells for $5,000 requires good skills in design. But only the very best in the world can design a table designed to sell for $50.
Right. Okay. So I guess
I think the purity of industrial design, meaning that things should have a certain affordability element in it, and yet be aesthetically pleasing, and yet meet the true requirements of the consumer. The cost boundary is a phenomenally challenging one, and the other example I would give is, Gordon Murray, who was the chief designer of the old Brabham and McLaren Formula One cars. He's today inspired by the Indian experiments, working on low-cost cars, because there is a huge, vista of innovation and cost advantage that one can work to, which is every bit as challenging to a true designer or an engineer, rather than the stereotype of what a cutting-edge product should be, which is perhaps in some ways enormously complicated.
Right. Dr. Sumantran, thank you very much for your thoughts, and hopefully, hope to hear more on this very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.